Start. So yesterday we learned the slok, Keami, Kene Amai, Jare Tapatrai, Ihai Nahi Jani, Kemone Hita Hoi, which means that who am I and why am I suffering in this world from three kinds of distress. And then if I don't know this, then how can I get any true welfare? He's saying first we need to understand, before we can get actual help, first we need to understand why we're struggling and who we are. And we have to also, in this case, he's approaching some source of knowledge who can help him understand this. It's not that just by our own meditation we can necessarily realize this, that it's helpful to have a guide. In this verse, it's Sanatana Goswami inquiring from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who am I? And this is the basic starting point of spiritual life, or self-inquiry. We see in all different kind of philosophical systems, they have this beginning stage of introspection. And a lot of this is through our own meditation and spiritual practice, but also to have a guide can be very helpful. Now, to find a proper guide is another challenge. In our path, we say that the best way to find a genuine guide is through deep internal prayer. And they also say, if according to your own nature, you'll get a certain kind of guide. And sometimes we see people get false guides who cheat them, and it can be very harmful for them and very psychologically disturbing. And this is also considered to be one kind of test in spiritual life, although it can be very difficult to go through. But anyhow, sometimes we come into those circumstances where we are cheated. And it can be difficult to not lose hope at that time, but if we sincerely pray to a higher power, then gradually we can come into the presence of a genuine helper, and then they can help us start to realize who we really are and why we are suffering. This is a good verse to learn to help teach us about the basic condition of our life here. And one of the important points is that we do suffer and what to do about that. You know, if you look at different traditions like Buddhism, you know, the basic understanding is that life is suffering, or that suffering is an unavoidable part of life. We don't say there is no happiness in life, but also suffering is a very unavoidable fact of life. It's said that the four problems in life or four unavoidable problems that come are birth, death, old age, and disease. And all four of these stages include some suffering. It said when you're in the womb for 9 months, for a few months of those times you're described to have consciousness. It said that when you're in the womb for the first few months you don't have awareness of your situation, according to the Bhagavatam. But then after that it said that you do become aware of your situation. At that time it becomes like being in a prison, because you're scrunched up in the fetal position, and there are many worms and other small kinds of bacteria that bite you. And if your mother takes any spicy food, then you feel burning also, or if she smokes. So it said generally you suffer great agony in the womb, actually, it said. In the scripture of the Bhagavatam, it says that at the time of suffering in the womb, the child has actually some kind of higher knowledge about... Yeah, it said something like they remember their past births, and they can also realize that they have... It said you don't have atheists in the womb. In the Bhagavatam, it said when you're in the womb, they actually have some knowledge of God. Because also, they said Paramatma, who is the super soul, he also lives in the hearts of everyone. But when you're in the womb, they say that you can perceive God in that way. And you pray and say at that time that when you're suffering so much, you say to the Lord, please, I don't want to suffer anymore like this. Please liberate me. But when we come out of the womb, we become surrounded by all our relatives. And we also become... Like the first amnesia is when you're a baby, you know, you forget. It's also because the agony is so difficult and so intense that you can forget your past also. And also the fact is that if we could remember our past births, we would become overwhelmed. And we desire to be illusioned. We desire to be covered over. It's said that when we become attached to our worldly life, then illusion will cover over our past intelligence and remembrance. So at that time, we forget and we start to engage in our material life. But the point is that also we tend to start to experience different kinds of happiness in this world, and we forget the suffering that we were experiencing in the womb. But then also we suffer from many kinds of diseases and from old age and ultimately death. So we're always suffering. And then during life, we have so many different kinds of suffering. And also happiness is described to be very minute compared to the potential that we can experience in happiness. Said that all living entities have the potential to experience bliss, ananda. And in this world, we get to taste some slight reflection of that or some semblance of that. But if we were truly in our real self, we're able to discover our true nature and be present in that spiritual form, the bliss we would be experiencing is millions of times greater than that we can even imagine that we would experience in this world. Said material happiness is described to be very low. Higher than material happiness is happiness in like the heavenly planets. Higher than that kind of happiness is happiness in like impersonal liberation, when you merge into the impersonal light. And then the highest kind of happiness is when you're absorbed in pure love in your spiritual relationship with Krishna or with the Brajavasis. And another example of our happiness is said like in this material world, happiness is like when you're one kind of torture. It's called one type of torture is that they take a person and they hold their head underwater for like 1 minute, and then they're dying to breathe. And then they'll pull them up for a few seconds, and then they can take a deep breath of air. And then just as they finish their breath of air, again, they push them back under. So it said that material happiness is described to be like that breath of air when you're coming up from under the water before you're plunged back down. Another example they give for material happiness is that it's described to be like scratching an itch. So you have different urges that come through the senses to see nice things, to taste nice things, to touch nice things, to have different relationships with different things. And when you scratch the itch of that urge, then you feel some sensation of happiness, just like if you have a really bad rash and you scratch it, you feel some kind of happiness. But that is not real happiness in the sense of the potential you have as a soul to experience real happiness in a real true relationship. The problem is that the basic premise is false, that you don't know who you really are, you're not established in your real nature, and therefore if the presumption is false, the assumption is false, then everything you build on top of that also is faulty. So the first problem of our first anartha is that we don't know who we really are, and we have a mistaken identity. It's called Swarup Brahm. We have a mistaken identity of this is who I am, this is the nature of my soul. But we forget that we've lived many different lifetimes in many different vehicles or bodies. And in those different bodies, we always identify as the body, but not as the soul within the body. And because of attachments, we continue in this cycle of birth and death. And until we can get rid of, or until we can sever these attachments and get rid of our false sense of self, then we cannot be liberated. So the first stage in spiritual life is first developing this inquiry of who am I? If we think I know who I am and I'm just this body and this is my name and this is where I live, and we don't have any sense of inquisitiveness beyond that, then it's hard to progress in spiritual life. When we come to this stage of inquiry, who am I really? What is my true nature? What is my true destiny? What is my real purpose and the meaning of my existence? And then why am I suffering? Then we can start to progress in spiritual life. If we look again at the example of Buddha, he was sheltered from the sufferings in this world. They tried to shelter him because they didn't want him to develop detachment. He was a prince, right? And they sheltered him from seeing anyone sick or dying or anything like that. But just one time he saw someone suffering and then saw a dead person, it rose this inquiry in his mind. That why do we suffer? And what is our nature? And then he began to work to get out of this cycle, and then he, went out and formed meditation, all that thing. So basically this is important for us to start. Who am I? And so this is shown as the starting point. by Sanatana Goswami when he asked this question to Mahaprabhu. And then for 2 months, Mahaprabhu described all different kinds of our philosophical conceptions to him. We know like the basic ideas. Talked about reincarnation and karma, and then ultimately about bhakti yoga, and how in other religions they talk about the negative side, which is that, okay, we're suffering in this world, we should try to, it's like nihilism, we should try to erase our identity or erase suffering and merge into nothingness. But in Vaishnavism we have a very, you want to say something? Tell me. Yeah, neti neti means I am not this, I am not this. Yeah. No, that's a necessary part of it. I guess in some, if you look in the deep teachings, maybe they're not always apparent, but in Buddhism it's about voidism. And in Shunyavad it's about, Shunyavad means voidism. And then you have Mayavad, which is everything is one and I want to merge in the oneness. And then part of the process is neti neti, you're right, which means I am not this, I am not that. So that's one of the things that you do in spiritual life. Which when you're trying to find out who the self is, you say, okay, am I this hand? Okay, I have a hand, I am not the hand, right? So that's one of the things we do, neti neti. But in Vaishnavism, we have the positive side also, which is that it said if you only practice neti neti, I'm not this, I'm not this, ultimately you cannot find who you are, so you ultimately can come to the conclusion that I am nothing. The Mayavadis give this example of a cabbage or an onion, and you peel off layer after layer after layer, trying to find the essence or the center, and then at the end you pull off the last layer and you see that there's nothing there. And so if you read authors like Alan Watts and different famous New Age philosophers in the West, they like to give this idea, that the self is illusion, all these so-called designations are illusory. So yes, that's one side of it. But the other side is that there's a positive side, which is that we actually have a spiritual nature and a spiritual identity, and we're trying to seek that out. In the Vedas, it said we are the children of divine nectar and we're destined to experience bliss. That's our destiny. Amritasya putra. Our destiny is transcendental ecstasy. So then the question becomes how to experience that and to transcend towards that stage. The Mayavad and the Buddhist idea of liberation is based on just getting rid of the state of suffering. But our idea is we want to go beyond that into the state of transcendental bliss. We're not so interested in just getting rid of suffering. We want to experience ecstasy. And that is our true destiny. And that comes in a loving relationship. That's another thing we need to talk about, is that if we really want to be happy... Say something? Say something. That's true. No, it's true. Actually, it's a good point. So then, truth seekers, basically, within different traditions, yeah. I guess you could look at it from different perspective. One is that what are the teachings of the faith at the deepest core, and then what is the seeking that is being done by the practitioner. So a lot of the practitioners are in different stages of spiritual evolution. Actually, our Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that all these different religions we find, or spiritual traditions we find, are all evolutionary stages in our spiritual development that we can progress through. And so even if we look at karma yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga, those are all described to be really one path, but different stages in that path. So ultimately everyone, you're right, everyone is seeking some kind of truth. And what we're trying to find is what is the actual final, deepest truth. So anyway, so let's move forward into the 6th verse.